At the beginning of the 7th century, the old world order was literally coming apart at the seams. The two greatest superpowers of that time, Byzantium and Sasanian Persia, had been tearing each other apart for decades in endless wars, turning the borders of the Middle East into a scorched wasteland. But while they were figuring out who was stronger, a process was already beginning in the scorching sands of Arabia that would reshape the map of the world. None of the enlightened strategists of that time could have imagined that their armies would soon be crushed. The man who would first deal one of the worst defeats in early Islamic history and then lead its armies to conquer two empires at once. His name is Khalid ibn al-Walid. Greetings to all history enthusiasts on our channel. Today's story became possible thanks to your support and interest in great personalities who changed the course of history. Special thanks to our patrons and sponsors, whose contributions allow us to conduct detailed research and create high-quality visualizations of the great battles of the past. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes about great commanders. And now, let's travel back to the 7th century. At the beginning of the 7th century, Arabia was of little interest to the great powers of that time. To the north was Byzantium, and to the east was Sassanid Persia. They had been at war with each other for decades, depleting their resources and redrawing borders, while the Arabian Peninsula seemed to remain outside of this great game. But that was only at first glance. The Arabian Peninsula was always considered by Constantinople and Ctesiphon to be the backwater of civilization. It was a mosaic of nomadic Bedouins, trading cities, oases and clans who had been settling disputes over livestock and pastures for centuries. There was no centralized authority, no regular army, and not even a written culture. The center of this entire fragile system was Mecca. The city had no rivers or fertile lands, but it did have the Kaaba. The sanctuary attracted tribes from all over Arabia, turning Mecca into both a religious center and a major trading hub. While some came to worship, others made deals. And the local elite, especially the Quraysh tribe, benefited greatly from this. And then a man named Muhammad appeared in Mecca, also from the Quraysh tribe, who began preaching at the Kaaba. He declared himself the messenger of the one God and brought a message that seemed revolutionary for those times. He said that all Muslims are brothers, regardless of clan or origin, and loyalty to God is above loyalty to one's tribe. The old elite of Mecca quickly realized that trouble was brewing and war began. However, this war was different from the previous skirmishes over livestock. This was a war to break the old system, a war of worldviews. It was in this world that our hero today, Khalid ibn Walid, grew up. He belonged to the aristocratic elite of the Quraysh tribe, which was responsible for military affairs in Mecca. From early childhood, Khalid was trained to be a warrior, not a merchant. While other children were learning the art of leading caravans, Khalid was mastering horseback riding, archery, and fencing. They say he was so strong and agile that he could ride any horse and wield a sword equally skillfully with both hands. Ironically, one of his close childhood friends and regular sparring partners in wrestling was Umar ibn al-Khattab, the future great caliph, with whom fate would cross Khalid's path more than once at the turning points of history. And when Muhammad began his preaching, Khalid's father became a fierce opponent of the new religion, seeing it as a threat to the old order, which was further complicated by inter-clan rivalries. So, when in 622 Muhammad and his followers were forced to flee from Mecca to Medina and a real war began soon after, Khalid already knew whose side he was on. As a true warrior of Mecca, he was a defender of its gods and its order. Khalid did not take part in the first clash at Badr in 624. He stayed behind to defend Mecca. However, the Quraysh suffered defeat at the hands of Muhammad's much smaller forces. A year later, the opponents met again at Uhud, and here, for the first time, Khalid's tactical talent truly emerged. The Meccans gathered an army of 3,000 men, while the Muslims numbered about 700. Khalid commanded the cavalry on the left flank. To cover his rear, Muhammad stationed 50 archers on a key height, with orders not to leave their position under any circumstances. Khalid tried several times to outflank the Muslim side, but the archers stopped him every time. The battle was not going in Mecca's favor. The Muslims were pushing the enemy back, and the enemy began to retreat. The archers on the height apparently decided that the enemy was fleeing and their task was complete. They abandoned their position and ran to collect the spoils, completely forgetting about the order. Khalid took advantage of this. He turned his cavalry around, went around the height from the rear, and struck the unprotected flank of the Muslims, who ended up being trapped from both sides. What had been a victory just minutes ago turned into a real disaster. 70 Muslims were killed, and Muhammad himself was wounded. But the confrontation with the Muslims did not end there. In 627, Mecca gathered a coalition of 10,000 warriors and set out to destroy Medina once and for all. Muhammad ordered a trench to be dug around the city. The siege dragged on. The coalition's supply lines began to fail. Disagreements arose among the allies. Khalid was assigned a task that he would later speak about with undisguised embarrassment: to kill Muhammad. He tried several times to cross the trench at night, but each time he was discovered and an alarm was raised. Then the Muslims began to pray right under the noses of the besiegers, and Khalid saw something that once again unsettled him. When half of those praying went down into prostration, the other half remained standing with their weapons. Then they switched. There was never a moment when all of them were vulnerable at the same time. This was a special wartime prayer, and Muhammad instituted it just then. Khalid then thought for the first time that it was impossible to catch this man off guard. Soon a strong wind rose, the coalition broke apart, and the siege was lifted. The Meccans left with nothing. After all these clashes, a crisis was brewing within Khalid. Being a professional military man, he couldn't help but notice that the Muslims were surviving and winning in defiance of all logic at the time. His own brother, who had already accepted the new faith, sent him a letter conveying the words of the Prophet. A man with such a sharp mind as Khalid could not remain ignorant of the truth for long. These words hit the mark. Khalid, who was used to trusting facts and results, realized that the old idols of Mecca did not give the inner strength he saw in his enemies. In 629 he rode to Medina. On his way he crossed paths with Amr ibn al-As, another future great strategist of Islam. Together they entered the city. They were already expected in Medina. The meeting with Muhammad was brief, but Khalid remembered it for the rest of his life. He spoke the words of accepting Islam and immediately said what had long troubled him: "I have killed so many Muslims. How can this be corrected?" And Muhammad replied that Islam erases everything that came before it. Tradition says the Prophet prayed for him individually. Khalid's conversion was a gain for the Muslim community comparable to obtaining the most advanced weapon of its time. The test did not take long to arrive. In the same year, a 3,000-strong Muslim detachment was sent north to the borders of modern-day Jordan to punish the Ghassanids, Arab vassals of Byzantium, for killing an ambassador. What began as a punitive expedition turned into a clash with a true military leviathan. Near the village of Mutta, the Muslims suddenly discovered that they were not facing just Bedouin detachments, but regular Byzantine troops and their allies, whose numbers exceeded the Muslims by several times. During the battle, one after another, 3 commanders appointed by the Prophet were killed. Then the commander's banner was handed over to Khalid. He found himself in a situation where defeat seemed inevitable, and total destruction was a matter of a few hours. Realizing that in a frontal clash they would simply be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, Khalid resorted to psychological warfare. At night, he ordered the right and left flanks to switch places, and the rearguard moved forward. In the morning, the Byzantines saw unfamiliar faces and assumed Muslim reinforcements had arrived. Khalid also ordered the horsemen in the rear to raise as much dust as possible, simulating the arrival of huge columns. While the enemy was in confusion, Khalid delivered several sharp blows and began an organized retreat. The Byzantines, fearing a trap in the desert, did not dare to pursue. It was a tactical miracle. Khalid preserved the remnants of the army and led them out of the encirclement. It is said that on that day 9 swords broke in his hands. Only one broad Yemeni blade lasted until the end. When news of the army's rescue reached Medina, the Prophet called him Saif Allah, the sword of Allah. The death of Prophet Muhammad in 632 triggered a massive political upheaval. Many tribes of Arabia decided that their obligations ended with the leader's life and refused to pay taxes. Some even proclaimed their own prophets. The young state found itself surrounded by enemies. The new caliph Abu Bakr showed iron will, refused to compromise, and tasked Khalid with suppressing the rebellion. It was a war for survival. The most dangerous opponent was Musaylima, who gathered a huge army in central Arabia. In the decisive Battle of Yamama, the Muslims faced unprecedented resistance. Khalid once again personally took part in the fight to boost morale and maneuverability. Despite the heavy losses among the Prophet's companions, Khalid saw it through to the end, ultimately uniting the peninsula. Now Arabia was a single monolith, and the sword of Islam was ready for triumph. Khalid was ready to strike at those who for centuries had considered the desert their buffer zone. In 633, Abu Bakr made a decision that changed history. He sent armies in two directions at once, to Iraq against Persia and to Syria against Byzantium. In the eyes of his contemporaries, this seemed like madness. Yesterday's shepherds were challenging an empire with a 1,000-year history. Both missions began as reconnaissance raids, but very quickly turned into something completely different. Khalid led the campaign in Iraq, the richest province of the Persians. His strategy was based on mobility. While the Persian army was heavy, clad in iron, and tied to roads and water sources, Khalid's warriors used the desert like a sea. They struck and disappeared into the sands, where the enemy's heavy cavalry simply sank. The first serious test was the Battle of the Chains. The Persian commander Karmuz, who despised the Arabs, ordered his soldiers to chain themselves together so that no one could desert. The idea made sense from a psychological point of view, but tactically it was suicidal. Khalid, however, used a tiring maneuver. He forced the Persians to march in the heat, changing the direction of attack until they were exhausted in their heavy armor. When the exhausted Persians finally formed up, Khalid challenged Hormuz to a duel and killed him in front of both armies. Deprived of their leader and mobility, the immobilized army became easy prey. The second battle at the river deserves a special mention. The Persian commander Karinz assembled a new army and took up a position on the bank of the Euphrates, with his back to the water. The idea was that the river would guard their rear, preventing the Muslims from outflanking them. But Khalid did not try to outflank them. He divided his army into three parts, hiding two of them in ambush on the flanks, and used the center to provoke the Persians into attacking. When they moved forward, the flank detachments struck from both sides at the same time. The Persian army was trapped between the Muslims in front and on the sides, and the river behind them. There was nowhere to retreat, and the Euphrates was stained with the blood of the Persian heavy infantry. Two battles, two destroyed armies. Ctesiphon began to grow nervous. And the Persian court sent a new army, led by Andazaga, an experienced border governor who knew the Arabs and respected their speed. He skillfully chose a position near Walaja, a wide plain with a ridge of hills behind him, protecting the rear, and enough space to deploy heavy infantry. 30 or even 50,000 men against a significantly smaller Muslim army. Khalid stretched his center, feigning weakness, and allowed the Persians to get drawn into battle, making them feel victory was near. But that was the trap. Under the cover of night, two cavalry groups of 2,000 riders each made a deep flanking maneuver. It was a classic double envelopment. The huge mass of Persian infantry was caught in an iron pincer. Panic began to spread. Andazagar, who had promised to crush the Arabs like flies, fled into the desert, where he died of thirst. The victory was absolute. Military historians rank it alongside Hannibal's triumph at Cannae, and the road to Hira, the capital of the region, was open. While Khalid was finishing off the Persians in Iraq, things were going badly on the Syrian front. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius gathered colossal forces, and the Caliph realized that only one man could save the situation. Khalid received orders to immediately transfer his troops from Iraq to Syria. The problem was that the usual routes were blocked by Byzantine garrisons. There was only one option left, to cross the Syrian desert, a waterless hell that was considered impassable for large forces. This march became legendary. To water the horses, Khalid made the camels drink as much water as they could, and then slaughtered them along the way, using the water from their stomachs. For 5 days, the army marched under the scorching sun, with no outside sources of water. When Khalid's exhausted warriors emerged from the sands behind the Byzantine fortifications, reports were not believed in Constantinople. Khalid's appearance in Syria was like a bolt of lightning out of a clear sky, forcing the Byzantines to regroup in panic. The Battle of Yarmouk lasted for 6 grueling days. The Byzantines pressed with their overwhelming numbers, and their heavy cavalry broke through the Muslim ranks time and again. At one point, the situation became so critical that the Arab women in the camp had to take up tent poles and stones to drive their retreating husbands back into the fight. Khalid used his cavalry like a fire brigade, moving them from one area to another to patch up holes in the defense. On the 6th day, Khalid saw the enemy was exhausted. He massed all his cavalry into a single striking force and delivered a crushing blow to the Byzantine flank, cutting them off from their lines of retreat. The huge imperial army was pressed against the steep cliffs of the Yarmouk River. The massacre began. The Byzantines, paralyzed by fear and the crush, fell into the abyss in entire ranks. When the dust settled, it became clear that Byzantium no longer existed in the Levant. After Yarmouk, the Levant opened up before the Muslims like a wide-open door. Cities fell one after another. In 637, Jerusalem itself agreed to surrender, but only personally to Caliph Umar. When Umar arrived, he entered the city on foot, wearing patched clothes and leading his camel by the reins. Patriarch Sophronius, who came out to meet the conquerors on a litter surrounded by his retinue, looked at this man and could not believe that he was the one who had just conquered half the world. And Khalid walked beside him, one of many in the Caliph's entourage, a man without whom this victory most likely would not have happened at all. It would seem that the Caliph should have become the uncrowned king of Syria, but Caliph Umar sent a letter ordering the Caliph to be removed from command. According to one version, Umar was afraid that people would believe that victories were brought by the Caliph himself and not by the will of the Almighty. He wanted to show that Islam would endure even without its brightest sword. Any other general in the Caliph's place, with such a loyal army behind him, could have started a rebellion and seized power. But the Caliph, showing unprecedented humility, resigned his authority. It was an act of discipline that impressed his contemporaries no less than his victories. Umar appointed the Caliph as governor, but he held this position for about a year, after which he came to the Caliph and said, "I am not suited for this role. I am a man of war." And Umar apparently knew this already, but he appreciated the honesty. Khalid ibn al-Walid died in 642 in the city of Homs. The greatest warrior, who sought death on the battlefield, died in his own bed. It is said that before his death he wept, showing his friends his body covered in scars. "I sought martyrdom in hundreds of battles," he said, "but here I am dying like an old camel." During his career, Khalid fought in more than 100 battles and did not lose a single one. He was a master of psychology, logistics, and tactics, who knew how to turn his warriors' weaknesses into their main strengths. And although he did not die by the sword, his name remained in history as a symbol of unbreakable will, tactical genius, and devotion to duty above personal ambition. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.
Пока.